Hello, everyone. This is Maria Feekes. I'm Executive Director of Adonis Fertility International. Today, we are back with our Hot Seat Wednesdays, and I'm so excited to have Kristen Armstrong back with us on her part 2 session from the 3-part series on the legal side of surrogacy in USA. Hi, Kristen.
Hi, how are you, Maria?
Good, good, good. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. All right. So the topic for today is very important, something that we got really like a lot of attention to and many, many questions. So I really hope that you could help us distill that. But also, I know, as a legal side, you typically are making, disclaimers, that whatever you're sharing here. So make your disclaimer, please.
Not legal advice, even though we're going to talk about legal stuff. And we are not forming any kind of attorney-client relationship. And if you have any questions, you want to speak directly with a lawyer that you have that established relationship with. But this is all just general legal information. Most of the information I'm going to provide is from a California perspective, but some of it is applicable throughout the United States. But overall, just general legal thoughts and guidance and advice and knowledge.
Wonderful, wonderful. And thank you so much for sharing, some of your best practices. This is really important. So in our part 2, we are talking about guide to legal surrogacy contracts in the USA. Okay, that's what really we're going to be focusing on. And I think although, as you mentioned in our previous topic in kind of fundamentals of surrogacy in USA, you mentioned that, definitely there are 2 sides attorneys, one attorney or team of attorneys representing surrogate, another team representing intended parents. And the contract, in essence, both sides are being represented. So today you're kind of wearing 2 hats, right? But it doesn't mean that that is your typical situation, right? Did I
Correct.
describe correctly?
Correct. I've represented the surrogates and I've represented the intended parents on a contract, but never at the same time. But I can offer both sides, both
Yeah,
perspectives.
integration.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. All right. So when speaking about, contract in USA for surrogacy, what are key areas you think should be considered?
Well, brace yourself because the contract's usually long. It's about 40 pages.
Okay.
That's America. But I have to say, overall, the contract phase, I think, is very exciting and positive. By the time you get to this contract phase, you've been matched with your surrogate. You are pretty much on the same page and have a mutual understanding of key issues like insurance, compensation, darker issues like abortion and termination, and life support, things like that. So by the time you come to the contract phase, a lot of things there's already a mutual understanding on many of the key issues. So there's not a lot of hard adversarial back and forth negotiations. I often tell my clients that this is happy law. Like, this is pretty much happy law. Like, there's other aspects of my practice where I do different areas of law, and things are very aggressive, very adversarial when you are in the contract negotiation phase. For surrogacy, when you are in that contract phase, it's like this great big exciting happy milestone. Like, you guys are ready to get this contract signed, because once this contract is signed, the next step is the embryo transfer. So key issues are, I kind of just briefly touched upon them. It's a 40-page contract, but it's more or less 40 pages. And it's very straightforward. It's intended parents. You are going to enter into this contract with the surrogate, and you're going to cover every single medical expense in connection with the preparation and during the pregnancy and the delivery. And you're going to take the baby home. And the surrogate, you are going to as obvious, you're going to take care of yourself and nurture this baby, and you're going to not claim any parental rights. And in exchange, you are compensated for your pain and suffering of being pregnant. So that's the gist of the contract. Key issues that you definitely want to make sure are in place are what are the specific benefits or compensation the surrogate's going to receive. For instance, every contract usually has something called a base compensation, and that ranges depending on whether or not the surrogate is a first-time surrogate or if this is her second or third surrogacy pregnancy. The surrogates that have done at least one surrogacy pregnancy and are doing a second or a third, those are called proven surrogates. Their base compensation is usually a bit higher. A first-time surrogate, the base compensation is anywhere from $35,000 to $50,000, depending on the state. And then there's add-ons. So that $35,000 to $50,000 doesn't start until she's confirmed pregnant by ultrasound. So it doesn't matter how many at-home pregnancy tests she takes and they come up positive. What matters is that first ultrasound appointment after the embryo transfer, where they see the little heartbeat flickering on the screen. On the first of the month after that appointment, that's when she starts receiving, typically, this is the industry standard, she starts receiving a portion of that base compensation. So if the contract says she's supposed to receive $35,000, then she's going to start to receive probably $3,500 a month for every month that she is pregnant until she delivers. And there's a couple of details. There's finer details with that base compensation that I'm not going to go completely down that rabbit hole, but base compensation, then the important add-ons like a monthly allowance to account for things that are hard to keep track of, like when she uses her cell phone in connection with fulfilling her obligations under the contract, if she uses a stamp, if she does local mileage, if she buys some prenatal vitamins. Sometimes the monthly allowance just covers those little incidentals that are hard to keep track of. Also a maternity clothing allowance. That's usually one flat payment, a one-time payment of anywhere from $600 to over $1,000. There's also the contract has to address when she goes on something called bed rest or activities restrictions. And that can be when she is just super pregnant, she's 38 weeks pregnant and the doctor goes, whoa, it's time to stop working. The doctor will put her on something called bed rest and activities restrictions. And the contract has to describe what happens from a compensation standpoint when she's put on bed rest and activities restrictions. So for instance, she might get a housekeeping childcare allowance when the doctor says, okay, it's time for you to rest. You're on bed rest, you're on activities restrictions, you cannot work. She might get a weekly housekeeping childcare allowance that continues on up until she gives birth and for a few weeks after she gives birth so that she can spend time focusing on recovery. Also, when she's on bed rest and activities restrictions, if she had a job, the doctor is telling her, you can't work right now. You're so pregnant, you need to rest and you can't work. So then the contract's going to address bed rest and activities restrictions as it relates to lost wages. So that's another aspect of the compensation that the contract needs to address. And it's very important to find out in the beginning of the match before you enter the contract phase, whether or not your surrogate's employed. Because if she's employed and then she goes on bed rest, whether it's because she's, super pregnant, she's 38 weeks pregnant, or there's a complication and she needs to rest and focus on just relaxing and she cannot work. If she is employed, that's an additional expense that you want as the intended parent to, prepare for and to kind of financially, budget for. So base compensation, monthly allowance, bed rest, activities restriction benefits, lost wages. There's also how much is the embryo transfer fee going to be, because that's a lot of work. She's injecting herself. She's going forward with the embryo transfer. And then after she has the embryo transfer, she has to continue on with injections. So there's usually a flat rate in connection with the embryo transfer. There's also there's always a benefit or a section in the compensation that addresses invasive procedures. So if she has to have, God forbid, you know, a DNC or an abortion, or she has an ectopic pregnancy, like the contract addresses all the positives, but also the dark sides.
Right.
So
Well, after, because there are risks involved, and
Mhm,
yeah.
mhm. So that's generally speaking some specific items that must be addressed in the compensation section. There's also, I always recommend and actually insist that there's a section about life insurance.
Yep.
It's my personal unsolicited opinion is that there has to be life insurance. I have represented surrogates that were very young, had never done this before. And for instance, this one case, she was not represented by an agency, and the intended parents, the attorney sent over this contract, and there was nothing addressing invasive procedures or life insurance. And I might have mentioned this in the last talk.
But
And
it's good to repeat, because, you know, those are things that are important, because, guys, you know, of course, like as intended parent, we understand, yes, that you're saying, gosh, like it's already so expensive, we're trying to save every penny. And then surrogates, when they're asking for things, they could come across as like, you know, I'm asking too much. But in reality, you know, that journey that last time we said is very emotional, it's very personal, and there are risks involved that could have really significant implications on everyone's life. It's important to put those safeguards, and just, yes, it doesn't mean that anyone is mean or not. So I'm so glad that you're bringing it up again.
yeah, it's just basic human respect and human decency. You know, there definitely should be a life insurance benefit and something addressing invasive procedures. Um, Also, you want to account for the medical expenses and how those are going to be paid for. Um, so is there going to be health insurance? Is there going to be just a cash pay journey entirely? Or is there going to be some kind of compensation? That's something you definitely want to have figured out by the time you're drafting the contracts. Also, escrow. The escrow deposits that you're going to have to make during the lifetime of the contract and the journey, that needs to be laid out in the contract. There's also going to be a required minimum amount of money that has to be held in the escrow throughout the entire pregnancy, and usually at least 6 months to a year after the pregnancy is over. There needs to be a certain amount of money held in escrow to account for medical bills that kind of come in or sent, you know, way later, because that's what we kind of run into here, is that the doctors sometimes send in the medical bills a little bit later. So escrow, health insurance, life insurance, base compensation, also establishing parental rights. How is that going to happen? What is the intention or the intended state where the parties, the intended parents and the surrogate, are going to use to establish parental rights? Usually the contract will say that the birth is going to happen in California, and therefore the parties are going to cooperate to establish parental rights in California courts. Some contracts have that the surrogate is going to relocate at week 32 to give birth in another state. So that's also addressed in the contract, is where she's going to deliver and where parental rights are going to be established. Going back to the compensation, one other thing is travel expenses. If she has to travel by air, or she has a very long car ride to the clinic for the embryo transfer, those types of expenses need to be covered for her. Another thing is abortion and termination. By the time you get to the contract phase, you want to make sure that everybody's in agreement or shares the same philosophy on abortion and termination. Some surrogates and some intended parents do not want to terminate under any circumstances, and it's really important that they're
On the page on it.
they're on the same page, and that they hold the same position and the same belief, because that can break the contract. If somebody is saying, oh, well, we want to terminate under, if there's any indication of any issue, we want to terminate, and then the other party saying, well, no, I never want to terminate, I don't believe in it, then that can break the contract. So that's something that you definitely want to have an understanding of, at the match phase, before you start drafting up the contract. Another aspect of the contract is communication. It's usually a small little section, but it's important. With communication, it depends on what everybody's looking for. Some surrogates, they just want to be left alone. They're like, I'm going to be pregnant, I'm going to grow this baby, and I'm going to go about my life. And just, I'm doing just fine, just kind of minding my own business and having my privacy. Some intended parents and some surrogates, they become a family together. They have a baby shower together. They talk often. It can be, there's no wrong or right way to go about this. Some of them never even talk to each other. So communication is key. I always tell my clients, whether you are the surrogate or you're the intended parent, is if the other side ever discusses money with you, please let me know. Because while it doesn't seem like a big deal, it can be. I have had people ask me, oh my gosh, do the surrogates get taken advantage of? And I'll say, actually, no, a lot of times the intended parents get taken advantage of. And it's when there's these side conversations about money that things can all of a sudden escalate to kind of a very stressful situation. So for instance, like if the intended parents are saying on the side, we are so grateful for everything you're doing, we're going to give you a little bit of extra money outside of the escrow. The surrogate might in the beginning feel, oh my gosh, I feel so appreciated. The intended parents really care about me. And she'll take the money. And meanwhile, she doesn't think anything of it, and she doesn't let her attorney know. And then all of a sudden, the intended parents are asking her to do certain things that she's not comfortable with. Like, well, we gave you all this money. Why don't you go and give birth over here? Or we need you to have a reduction, and we need you to watch the baby for a month after you give birth, because we're not going to be there, and we gave you all this money. Now she feels a little, pressured and coerced, and she's frankly been a little manipulated. The
Or
same thing.
or they could have been even misunderstanding without an intent, right? We all understand things. Right.
Right. Same thing on the other side. The surrogate can say, I'm having trouble paying for my child's school this month. Will you please help me?
Like,
And
give me an
the intended,
advance or something.
what's that?
Like, give me an advance. Like, give me more money this month, less money the other months.
And the intended parent is usually so unbelievably grateful. The intended parent or parents don't want to upset the surrogate, so they don't discuss it with their attorneys. They don't discuss it with the agency. They just start giving money on the side, and all of a sudden this is now kind of gotten out of control. So I always tell my clients, please, it's great to have ongoing communication if you want. It's great, but the second anybody starts talking about money, it's probably not going to be a big deal, but just let me know. I just want to be aware of that in case I can see any kind of issues starting to develop.
I
And
think you
so,
just nailed it. Yep. We have seen that, happening as well. And sometimes, you're trying to protect both parties, but if those sides conversations are happening, it's really hard to control. And next thing you know, there are hurt feelings. There are things about, like you said, I don't want to get her upset because she's carrying the baby. What if she gets nervous or stops eating healthy or whatever? Really tough emotional situations, and you want to avoid that.
yeah, and it's good to call your lawyer in that situation, because let the lawyer be the bad guy.
Yeah.
Like, just say, I'm sorry, I really want to help you, or I really want to take that money, but my lawyer says no. Like, blame me. It's very okay, and then that way you can keep the peace between, everybody can kind of keep the peace between each other. Um, a couple of other things just to think about. We talked about abortion a little bit, multiples, if the embryo splits, is the surrogate okay carrying twins? Are the intended parents okay having twins? How many embryos are going to be transferred at a time?
Yeah.
Also, who's going to be in the delivery room?
Mm-hmm.
And also the surrogate's conduct. There's always a section in there about, the obvious. Please don't drink, don't do drugs, don't get tattoos, all those obvious things. And sometimes I've had intended parents request interesting things, like they did not want the surrogate to get out of bed or shower for 3 days after the embryo transfer. And I said, well, we should follow the doctor's advice. Like, that might alienate the surrogate. So there's always going to be a section about the surrogate's conduct and restrictions and things like that that should be in the contract. And I think that's a good overview. An important one is if somebody's breaching the contract. What
Mm-hmm.
if the intended parents aren't funding the escrow according to the payment schedule? What happens then? Also, what if the surrogate is breaching? We find out that she's gone skydiving and, after the embryo transfer. Or, I mean, I've never actually had that happen. Some things that do happen.
Hypothetically, right.
Yeah. Some things that do happen is she just doesn't go to her doctor's appointments and she doesn't communicate. And then what to do when she is materially breaching the contract. The contract's going to address that. There's certain things that can be done. One is the payments are stopped.
Mm-hmm.
We can get a court order, an emergency court order. That's really the last resort. The main avenue is usually compensation is somehow altered when she's breaching. When the intended parents are breaching, there's the threat of, look, we're not going to move forward with establishing parental rights, and hopefully then the parents start complying.
Mm-hmm.
But that's why it's important to vet the intended parents before the match. Get the assurance that they have the financial means to pay for this.
Mm-hmm.
Speak to them, get to know them, do perhaps a background check, like do your due diligence. Same thing with the surrogate. So
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I know I had questioned before about background check. What, typically you have you have that clause about that. It doesn't mean that it's mandatory, but it's something states that if either party wishes to do that, they have the right to do so. Am I understanding it correctly?
correct. Also, either party can request a psychological screening in my contracts.
Mm-hmm.
I've definitely had situations where I've represented one side and I thought, the other side should request a psychological screening. Not often, just maybe once or twice in the last 10 years, but the option is there. But yeah, either side can request those. They're not going to get all the information. They're just going to, when there's an agency involved, the agency will hold the information and just give the green light or the red light on the report. But the option to have some kind of screening or some report done and using that option can provide additional assurance, like peace of mind and everything. So I always talk about that in the contracts too when I'm reviewing it with either the surrogate or the intended parents.
Okay. Well, thank you, guys. I don't know how you feel, but like I have a whole page already written in notes.
Yeah, it's a
And I've
lot.
been through those contracts before, but I think this is such a gold information. I know you kind of mentioned that, but still, let's kind of give maybe timeline to parents, because if it gets like way longer, then you could say, gosh, like something, then it's maybe not right, maybe it's not meant to be. What is the typical time of like this contract negotiation, or is it even there is a lot of contract negotiation between parties? What do you typically expect?
I always tell my clients, you tell me to jump and I'll say how high. I have turned around a contract from drafting to signing within 24 hours.
Yeah.
But that's when everything has already been agreed upon. So when the compensation, the benefits package is already agreed upon, there's already an understanding of the, of insurance, of who's going to, how the medical expenses are going to be provided for, escrow, abortion and termination, and, the number of embryo transfers, everything we kind of talked about. It can be done within 24 hours. Typically it's about 1 to 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And it really just depends on how accessible, or really not accessible, but available the surrogate is, and the intended parents to review the contract with their respective attorney. But yeah, it usually should not take more than 3 weeks, and there should not be a lot of back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
I have
Mm-hmm.
had cases that go like, once there's more than 2 back and forths, it's like, okay, we're getting into some trouble here, where people just aren't agreeing, and there's just not a mutual understanding that maybe was ever in place. And so when there's a lot of back and forth, then it's kind of a concern that maybe this isn't a good match.
Yeah, that's good that you mentioning it. Watch for those red signs, because guys, at the end, you're gonna be with this person for a very long time, right? You're gonna be with each other for a very long time, and trust is very important. So I'm glad you're bringing it up. Okay. You touched on quite a few examples of like possible risks and conflicts, but if there is anything else that coming up to your mind, like supposedly the contracts were drafted good, everything is good, but have there been any like any maybe thoughts once the journey was finished, people like, oh gosh, like I wish we would have thought a bit ahead of time, or I wish this would have been addressed. Have you seen any of those more like grayish area?
Actually, not really, because I mean, the compensation section at the end of the contract, it's really accounted for nearly almost every single possibility. So that's why that's why these contracts are so long, because it has the goal of addressing nearly every single um scenario that could arise. I'm trying to think about what I've come across lately. Um the it's As long as the contract like accounts for like the worst what ifs, then everything should be okay. So, or there's a way or a method to get a resolution as soon as possible. So if the surrogate is not going to doctor's appointments, boom, there's something in the contract about that. If the intended parents want breast milk, there's something in the contract. I think the one thing that I do have noticed is that, I kind of talked about it before, is the intended parents or the surrogate, like, just vocalizing to somebody when they just have a question. If they're like, I don't know if that's right, or I don't want to come across greedy or overly restrictive and ungrateful as the intended parent, like, you should be able to call up your lawyer or call up your agency case manager and just run something by them without any judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I have seen, I have seen after the fact surrogates tell me, well, I didn't get this, I didn't get that. And I said, well, that's in your contract, when I was representing the surrogates. And she'll say, well, I didn't want to come across greedy. I'm like, but this is your contract. This is your bread and butter, and you can always call me, but she just didn't call me.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And it's really
One,
not your position to come and say like, hey, did you get, like, you don't check in, right? Like you're expecting as an attorney, that's not your role. It's probably role of the agency, well, at least that's how we see it, right? You know, or person who is receiving that benefit, but yeah.
yeah, it's once like you'll typically hear the attorneys, a lot of attorneys will say, once this contract is signed, I'm done until it's time to establish parental rights. I don't operate like that, because I just think that, you know, I want to be emotionally supportive throughout the whole time. And it, for the most part, it's 99% of the time it's worked out that I'm always here as support, and I do get a couple of phone calls, maybe once or twice throughout the journey, and you know, so it's not like it's some extra work for me. You know, but my point is just that everybody should be able to call somebody if they have a question, or they have just like a concern. And some attorneys will say, well, no, I'm not going to address your question or your concern because I'm done. The contract's been signed and I'll see you when it's time to establish the parental rights. Um, that's not, there's nothing necessary. I don't want to, that's just a different philosophy that I don't do.
Mm-hmm.
So it is something to ask your attorney when the
Mm-hmm.
time comes, like whether you are the intended parent or the surrogate, like, hey, are you accessible after this contract is signed? I won't call you all the time, all day long and all night, but if I have a question or if I think there's an issue, are you there? And hopefully they say yes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so one thing that um, some of my clients will come back and talk about is the medical expenses,
Mm-hmm.
and making sure that there was, if it's the surrogate, making sure that she confirmed there was enough money at all times in the escrow account, and with the intended parent, making sure that they anticipated the medical expenses and what was still outstanding. That's something that you always want to speak to your agency about, and also the insurance carrier or the insurance broker,
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that, you know, there's nothing that's possibly lingering and you get a surprise bill after the escrow has been closed.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing that some people come back to me with. Well, I didn't know, and like now I have this bill on my credit and the intended parents aren't paying. It's like, okay, well, these things, this is how we're going to take care of that now. But
Mm-hmm.
preemptively, the surrogate should always know or have an idea of how much money's in the escrow, and the intended parents should always have an idea of outstanding medical bills.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. That's phenomenal. And like you mentioned before that, you know, you suggesting, or at least in your contract, that there is portion of escrow, or there is a minimum amount held in escrow for up to 6 to 12 months, because like you're
Yeah.
saying, there are some medical bills, so some things could come up. So yeah, this is something for the parents definitely to budget for as well. And just know. And so then whatever money is not used will be returned back to them, correct?
Mm-hmm. And lately, just to manage everybody's expectations, in the last year or two, now the escrow requirement to hold the minimum balance is becoming longer, for like 12 months to 18 months,
Wow.
because so just to
Mm-hmm.
mentally and financially brace yourself that money's just going to be sitting there for probably at least a year. Um,
After the
and
birth, not from the moment of
after the
signing and
birth,
starting, after the birth. Okay. Okay.
after the birth. And correct, the intended parents should be getting that money back.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some agencies charge a flat rate where they keep that money.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's so that's one thing you always want to understand when you sign with an agency. What happens to that money in the escrow? I get that back, correct? It's something
Mm-hmm.
to verify. Or maybe you don't, because it's just this flat rate, and it actually financially worked out for you as the intended parent. Um, and there's some great escrow companies out there that have a lot of great transparency. There's clarity, there's seed trust, for instance, that you just sign online and you can see a status of
I
the
really love
account
that.
and distributions. There's also some escrow companies that don't have as much transparency. And frankly, I would recommend you steer clear of that, steer like away from that, because why wouldn't you want to know the status of your account and where the money's going?
Very.
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah. So you mentioned clarity and seed trust. I know we're using, per your recommendation, we're using seed trust. Guys, I need to tell you, I have been very impressed by
Good.
the work in the system, just like exactly what you're saying, that there is really high level of transparency, and they have a team assigned to you. Anyway, we're not here like to give them extra commercial, but when people are doing, when company are doing great work, I want to give them kudos. So it was very, very good. We
Good.
might have a topic on that. Also listening to, we might have a topic with the insurance team as well. Have had some like really incredible teams supporting and like doing the revisions, explaining to parents and to, the surrogate, all of the protections, because there is definitely a lot things to think about and it still goes into your protection. So you mentioned, so I kind of want to close by, what questions you would recommend intended parents or gestational carriers should be asking their attorneys when they're searching for the good support. You already mentioned one. You said, hey guys, do ask, or at least, there is not a bad or, good or bad. It's more like the preferences as far as how much accessibility you have to your attorney after the contract has been signed, right? So this is one question I wrote down. Anything else parents should be asking?
Ask them
Parents and
what's that?
parents and gestational carriers, sorry, both sides.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, ask how long have they been doing this? What
Okay.
is their success rate with establishing parental rights? What does your legal fee include? What if the baby comes early and we don't yet have parental rights established? What happens and how do you handle that? How like we mentioned before, how accessible are you? If I have a question, can I call you? Can I email you along the way? Or are you done when the contract is signed and then you resurface when it's time to establish parental rights? Some attorneys will say that I also hold escrow. Why don't you lump it all together? And there's nothing illegal about that. I don't hold escrow because you're wearing two separate hats. And if I'm representing the intended parents and I'm also holding escrow, and the intended parents are saying to the escrow company that which happens to be me who's representing them, hey, we want to stop payment on XYZ, and this creates a conflict of interest, that
Right.
because me as the attorney, I have to in theory agree with them and present their position and support them and represent their position and argue for their position. But if I'm also holding the escrow, it creates kind of an ethical mess. So if your attorney's holding escrow, you should ask, well, how do you handle conflicts? How do you handle, disputes over compensation then? Because you're representing me, but you're also holding the escrow. My recommendation always is just keep it separate, but
Very wise.
and then a lot of the things I just said apply to the surrogate. The surrogate can always ask the attorney, like, are you holding escrow as well? Because sometimes they don't know, because the escrow is usually a different name. And so they don't realize that it's the intended parent's attorney or their own attorney, which would be odd if their own attorney didn't explain it to them, but there's always a chance. So ask about that as a surrogate. Ask, what if they don't pay my bills? Will you help me on some level? What if I have a question? Can I call you? Same thing to ask. How successful have you been in obtaining parental rights? Because I don't want my name on the birth certificate. Those kinds of things.
Okay. Thank you so much. One question came up in addition to what we already discussed, so I'm going to read it. It says, you mentioned that surrogacy compensation is around 35. I should say base compensation, right? Because there are different categories. So the surrogacy base compensation is around 35 to 50,000. Which state would that be? Here in California, it's around 55 to 75, then plus 15,000 for experienced surrogates. So what have you seen?
Okay, I have seen 45 to 50,000 as a base compensation in California for a first-time surrogate. I'm not seeing 55,000 to 75,000 for a first-time surrogate in California. I don't know who's doing that. That's a very generous compensation for a first-time surrogate in California. What I'm normally seeing is now 45 to 50,000 as the base in California. In other states, I'm seeing 35 in Arizona, in Texas. But even then, 35 is becoming more and more rare. Washington, 40, 45,000 as the base. And then as the person just asked or said, then you have about $10,000 to $15,000 in extras, depending on lost wages and things like that. But
And
the base,
plus extra for the experienced surrogate, correct?
yeah.
So maybe 10% or so more. Like, what do you see on average?
I am seeing for a second, I'm seeing the comment pop up. For like a second or third time surrogate, I'm seeing anywhere from 75,000 to 95,000 as the base compensation.
In California.
I have an idea of who is probably quoting 55 to 75,000 as a first time surrogate in San Diego. I can tell you that there's other agencies in San Diego that they're not doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, it is. I can see Seth's right in the comment. I mean, it is that is that specific agency's compensation package. Yeah, I would. I'm just looking at her comments. That is that specific agency's compensation package where they're saying our first time surrogates are 55 to 75,000. I know several agencies that are incredible that the compensation for the first time surrogate is 45, 50,000. Whether it's San Diego, whether it's Adonis, it's, the 55 to 75,000 for a first time surrogate is actually frankly like an outlier. I think you can find first time surrogates for $45,000, $50,000 elsewhere.
Okay.
And that's a good point, Seth. Do your research. Talk to a few different agencies because they all have a different approach. They all have different philosophies. They all have different costs. Some of them are very corporate run. They're very professional. They're very polished. They're very organized. And it's kind of a cold, like not emotional and, experience. Some of them are just small agencies, owned by one person, and that person becomes like an aunt to the family. There's also just, agencies in the middle that offer both. Like they become close family friends and they also just are incredibly polished and professional and everything is, organized. So definitely I would interview a few agencies.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great suggestion. Just, I guess both ways. As we were saying, here are the questions you ask from different legal support, right? So you could find the best match. The same goes to all of the other portions. All right. Okay, great. Well, but going back to compensation, if there is a higher compensation that you're saying an outlier, then ask questions why. Maybe it's like I don't know, like a dream surrogate with like medical degree and, ton of, I don't know, hypothetically, like what should be the reason for that? Ask that. Absolutely. There should be some reasons why it's
Old
higher.
uterus.
That's a good one.
That's a cold uterus. I mean, the medical degree doesn't, we're
Well,
not using
we
our
had some
eggs.
parents. Well, I know, but we had
Yeah.
some parents where they were saying, I want to have, surrogate with a medical degree because when
Mhm.
as she's taking care of herself and the baby, or if there is any
Mhm.
emergency, she's more prone to recognize some risk sides. So that was their idea,
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. Well, I am so guys, thank you for being with us today. So that's going to be posted absolutely if you need to come back to it, because a lot of great information. Kristen, as always, you have been so phenomenal about being transparent and caring and sharing as much as you can. We're definitely going to add contact information on the archive for you. Okay, so if anyone wants to reach out to you, that would be phenomenal. But yes, thank you guys.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks, Maria. It's so good to see you.
Yeah, bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.